The storm begins. The city had a way of swallowing sound when the rain came hard. That night, thunder cracked across the skyline, rolling through glass towers and narrow alleys, rattling windows in small apartments and echoing across streets that had become shallow rivers. The storm had not been predicted, at least not this fiercely. Power flickered in several blocks, streetlights went dark, and traffic signals blinked uselessly as cars splashed through water they shouldn't have been. Driving in at all. Maya Wilson stood beneath the tiny awning of a shuttered corner shop, her daughter Leah tugging gently at her coat sleeve. Leah's umbrella had flipped inside out 3 times already, and finally Maya folded it away, choosing instead to shelter the child against her chest. Leah was only 6, a small girl with bright eyes and a toy bunny clutched tightly in one hand. She was humming a tune softly under her breath, her attempt at distracting herself from the fear that came with thunder too close and lightning too sharp. Almost home. "Baby," Maya whispered, brushing damp curls away from Leah's forehead. Her own hair clung to her cheeks, rain soaking her cotton blouse through the worn jacket she wore. The night was brutal, but she'd walked in worse storms before. Being a single mother had taught her something: storms always end. You just had to keep moving through them. She glanced down the block, eyes narrowing. Ahead, outside the tall Midtown business tower, a man stood beneath a broken awning, his figure sharp against the cascade of water around him. He didn't move, except to shift his coat tighter across his shoulders. The glow from the emergency generator above the entrance flickered, illuminating his face for brief seconds at a time. Strong jaw, wet hair slicked back, glasses fogged from the humidity. But there was something in the way he stood that caught her attention. He looked lost. Not in direction, but in purpose. Her steps slowed. She knew him. Everyone in the building did. Jacob Reed, CEO of Reed and Wallace Technologies, a man who rarely spoke more than a sentence to anyone unless it was business, a man people both respected and feared for his precision, his cold control. Maya had worked 3 floors below his office for nearly 2 years now, invisible like many assistants and coordinators. She filed things, typed minutes, answered calls, and made sure deadlines aligned. She was good at her job, but unremarkable in a world of sharp suits and perfect resumes. Yet here he was, not in the safety of his penthouse, not stepping into a sleek car, but standing in the rain with the rest of them, alone. His phone hung useless in his hand, screen black, no power. The packing garage across the street had been closed by the storm. The streets were flooding fast. Leah tugged again. "Mommy, that man looks cold." Maya followed her daughter's gaze. For a moment, she considered walking past. Jacob Reed was not her responsibility. He was her boss's boss's boss, a man who barely noticed she existed. But the storm howled again, wind forcing rain sideways, pelting them so hard it stung. Something stirred in her chest then. A tug of empathy she couldn't ignore. She stepped forward. "Mr. Reed," she called, raising her voice over the storm. He looked up, surprised, as if it startled him to hear someone say his name outside a boardroom. Maya steadied her voice. "You don't have anywhere to go, do you?" For a second, silence. Then Leah peeked from behind her mother's coat and spoke before Maya could. "You can come with us. Mommy made soup." Jacob blinked, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Maya's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "What she means is, our place isn't much, but it's warm and dry. You shouldn't be out here like this." He hesitated. She could see the calculation behind his eyes, the instinct to refuse, to hold distance. He was not a man accustomed to accepting help, least of all from someone like her. But then thunder cracked again, so close it shook the awning above their heads. He finally nodded once. Just for the night. They began walking together, water rising around their shoes. Maya held Leah's small hand tightly while Jacob walked silently beside them, his tall frame hunched against the wind. He didn't speak, but his presence was heavy, deliberate. And yet, strangely, she didn't feel uneasy. By the time they reached Maya's building, a modest brownstone with peeling paint and a narrow stairwell, Leah's bunny was soaked, her tiny arms shivering. Maya unlocked the door quickly and ushered them inside. Warmth enveloped them at once. The faint aroma of stew lingered in the air, mixed with the clean scent of laundry detergent and the soft glow of vanilla candles. "Home," Leah whispered. Tossing her bunny onto the worn couch and running to the small kitchen table, Jacob stood still in the entryway, dripping water onto the mat. He looked out of place here, this man who usually commanded rooms with polished marble floors and glass. Walls, Maya noticed it too. She almost apologized for the smallness of the apartment, the old furniture, the thin rug covering scuffed floors. But instead, she drew a steady breath and said simply, "You can use the bathroom to dry off. I'll get you something to wear, my brother's old clothes. Probably your size." Jacob gave a small nod, no words, and disappeared down the hall. Maya moved quickly, setting the table, checking the pot on the stove, and praying the storm would mask the hum of the refrigerator that sometimes failed when the power flickered. She didn't want him to see how close she had been cutting things this month. One missed paycheck and everything could fall apart. Just as she was ladling soup into bowls, there came a sharp knock at the door. Her stomach dropped. She opened it. Halfway. On the other side stood her landlord, Mr. Grant, a man in his 60s, comb-over plastered against his forehead, eyes narrowed with habitual disapproval. "Maya," he barked, voice sharper than the wind outside. "It's the 28th. I know, I get paid Friday." "You said that last month? I'm not a charity." His eyes shifted past her shoulder. "Oh, got company tonight? That your man?" Maya's chest tightened. "No, he's, What's funny?" Grant cut in, raising his voice. "You people always got money for takeout and new hair, but can't pay rent. And now you've got some guy in your house. Bet he doesn't even know what kind of mess he's walking into." Before Maya could reply, a voice interrupted coldly from behind her. "I do, actually," Jacob said, stepping into the light. He was wearing the old Duke University hoodie she had handed him, his hair still damp but his presence unmistakable. His voice carried authority even stripped of boardrooms. "And if I hear you speak to her like that again, I'll make sure." "The city hears about it too," Grant's smirk faltered. "Wait, you're Jacob Reed? You run that firm downtown?" Jacob didn't answer. He only stepped closer. "Leave, now." Grant scoffed, but his eyes flickered with unease. "Touch her again," Jacob added, voice low, "and I'll have your license pulled by sunrise." For a long moment no one moved. Then Grant spat to the side, muttered something under his breath, and stormed off into the rain. Maya's shoulders sagged as she shut the door. Leah peeked from behind the couch, frightened. Jacob looked at Maya, his expression softer now. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to overstep." "You didn't?" she said quietly, steadying her daughter. "He does that every time I'm late." Jacob hesitated, then said, "Let me help. I can cover a few months. No strings." Maya shook her head firmly. "Don't, I've got this. You shouldn't have to." But when she looked at him again, she didn't see pity. She saw concern, real human concern. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something shift. Not in the storm outside, but in the air between them, as they sat at the table. Leah's laughter softening the silence, Maya realized this night was going to change everything. She didn't know how or why, but she knew it in her bones. The storm had brought Jacob Reed to her door. And storms, she knew, always left the world looking different when they passed. The morning after the storm had begun to quiet sometime before dawn, though Maya had not noticed when the thunder last rumbled or when the rain softened into a whisper. She had been too caught up in the silence that followed dinner, the heavy presence of a man she still could not quite reconcile with the one she saw every day in the building's elevators. Jacob Reed, her employer's employer, a man wrapped in power and control, was now sitting in her small living room, his frame folded awkwardly into her second-hand armchair as though the simple fabric dared to challenge his usual leather-bound world. He had eaten slowly, carefully, perhaps unused to homemade stew served in mismatched bowls on a table that wobbled if Leah leaned too hard. He had spoken little, answering Leah's questions with polite nods or one-word responses, but Maya had noticed the way his eyes softened whenever her daughter laughed. That softness was what unsettled her the most, because it was real, and it was not the look of a man keeping up appearances. By the time she had put Leah to bed, her little girl asleep within minutes of curling against her stuffed bunny, Maya had returned to find Jacob still in the chair. She had offered him the couch, even apologized for the thin blanket, but he had only given a faint smile and assured her it was more than enough. Then the silence had returned, a silence not uncomfortable but so unfamiliar that it made Maya restless. She had lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, washing dishes that did not need rewashing, waiting for him to break the quiet. But he had not. Instead, his gaze had stayed on the small bookshelf against the wall, where her collection of old novels and borrowed textbooks lived side by side. And when she finally turned in, lying awake for what felt like hours, she thought of how strange it was that a man who could command the largest boardrooms in the city could sit so still, so quietly in her modest apartment without a single complaint. When dawn finally broke, it did not bring sunlight. The clouds still pressed heavy against the skyline, but the rain had thinned to a drizzle. Maya was already awake, moving about the kitchen in the early hours. Careful not to wake Leah, she brewed coffee slowly, the old machine rattling before sputtering to life, the sound filling the small space with familiarity. She liked mornings, even tired ones. They made her feel as though she had one small piece of the world she could control before everything else demanded too much of her. But this morning was different. Because she was not alone, she glanced toward the living room and saw Jacob awake, his elbows on his knees, hands steepled as he stared at the floor. He had not changed out of her brother's hoodie, and the sight of it nearly made her smile. It was the most ordinary she had ever seen him, stripped of his tailored armor, looking almost human. She carried 2 mugs to the table and set one down near him. "It's not fancy," she murmured, "but it'll warm you up." He looked up, surprised, as though the simple act of someone handing him coffee had caught him off guard. He accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you," that sounded heavier than it should have. Maya sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her own mug, letting the steam rise between them. For a long moment neither spoke. It was Jacob who finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry about last night," he said, his voice low. "Your landlord shouldn't treat you that way." Maya lifted a shoulder. "He's just doing what he does. I'm used to it." "That doesn't make it right." "No, but it makes it normal." She held his gaze, steady but tired. "And normal is what I can handle right now?" Jacob's eyes lingered on her, searching as though he wanted to argue but didn't know how. Finally, he said, "You shouldn't have to handle it alone." The words struck something in her chest, something she didn't want to feel. She set her mug down a little too quickly. "I do what I have to. Everyone does." For a while, they let the quiet stretch again. Outside, a siren wailed distantly. Somewhere down the block, a neighbor's dog barked at the drizzle. Inside, Leah stirred in her room, the creak of the bed springs echoing faintly through the wall. Jacob's gaze shifted to the sound, softening again. "She's a good kid," he said, almost to himself. Maya nodded. "She is. She's everything." When Leah finally padded out in her pajamas, hair tangled from sleep, she grinned at Jacob as though he had always belonged there. "You stayed," she announced, climbing onto the couch. "Does that mean you're having pancakes too?" Maya flushed. "Leah, we don't have—" But Jacob interrupted. "I love pancakes." His lips curved into the faintest smile, the kind Maya had never seen in the elevator, the kind that made Leah clap her hands with delight. So Maya made pancakes thin and uneven but warm and watched as her daughter beamed while Jacob ate every bite as though it were a delicacy. And though she reminded herself over and over that this was temporary, just a strange detour in their lives, she could not ignore the quiet sense that something had shifted. Not in the world outside, but in the air between her small kitchen walls. When breakfast ended, Jacob stood, pulling his coat back on. The drizzle had nearly stopped, and the city would soon resume its restless rhythm. Maya braced herself for his departure. She expected formality, perhaps a polite thank you, and nothing more. But instead he hesitated at the door. "I don't usually stay anywhere," he admitted slowly, his voice thoughtful, almost reluctant. "But last night I haven't slept that deeply in years." Maya blinked, unsure how to respond. Then he added, "You said you didn't want help with rent. I'll respect that. But if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." She nodded, and for the briefest second his gaze lingered on hers, steady and unguarded, before he stepped out into the damp morning. Leah, still clutching her bunny, whispered, "Mommy, is he our friend now?" Maya exhaled slowly, her chest tight with emotions she could not name. "I don't know, baby. I don't know yet." But even as she said it, she knew the storm had left more than rain behind. It had left a connection neither of them had expected. And though she tried to dismiss it, tried to fold it away like a dream, she could not shake the quiet certainty that their paths were not done crossing. Not by a long shot. The unexpected return the days that followed slipped into their usual rhythm, or at least Maya tried to convince herself they did. She rose early, prepared Leah's breakfast, packed her modest lunch for school, then made the trek across the city to her office job, where her hours blurred together in the monotony of filing reports, drafting emails, and ferrying documents between managers who rarely looked up from their screens. Yet beneath the routine, a subtle current lingered, a trace of that stormy night that she could not quite erase. It wasn't Jacob Reed himself who stayed in her mind, at least that was what she told herself. It was the strange dissonance of seeing him in her world. She had built her life on resilience, on getting by with little, on not expecting anyone to rescue her. But in the space of a single evening he had intruded upon that narrative, quietly, without grand gestures, simply by being there in her small apartment, by eating her imperfect pancakes with an expression that suggested they were worth more than the finest restaurant meal. That memory clung stubbornly, no matter how often she pushed it aside. At work, she avoided the top floors where his office towered above hers like some unreachable kingdom. She told herself it was better this way, that the man she had seen in her home was not the same man behind the glass doors and polished conference tables. In the office he was a figure of precision, reputation, and wealth, a man who did not stumble into storms unprepared or sleep beneath thin blankets on second-hand couches. And yet, every time the elevator chimed, her pulse betrayed her, expecting him to appear. He never did, at least not near her desk. That distance should have been a relief. Instead, it left her oddly restless, as though she had glimpsed another life through a window and then been forced to pull the curtains closed again. Leah, on the other hand, had no such restraint. She spoke often about Mr. Jacob, as though he were some newfound character in her small, wondrous world. At bedtime, she asked if he liked her bunny, if he really meant it when he said he loved pancakes, if he might come back when it rained. Again, Maya deflected with soft chuckles and gentle distractions, unwilling to feed her daughter's hope with uncertainty. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that men like Jacob Reed did not stay. They brushed against your life briefly, leaving sparks in their wake, and then returned to their own uncheckable worlds. But fate, Maya knew from experience, did not always respect the boundaries one tried to build. It was a Thursday when it happened. The office buzzed with its usual midweek exhaustion, papers shuffling, printers whirring, colleagues murmuring about weekend plans they would likely cancel. Maya was bent over a stack of invoices, her hair falling loose from its clip, when a shadow passed across her desk. She looked up, half expecting a manager asking for another favor. But it was him. Jacob Reed, in his tailored navy suit, stood at her desk with the same calm presence he carried in boardrooms, though his eyes carried something gentler, almost private. For a moment she forgot how to breathe. Around them, heads turned discreetly, whispers rippled. Why was the CEO speaking to an assistant 3 floors down? But Jacob seemed unaffected by the weight of attention. "Ms. Wilson," he said, his voice measured but not cold. "Do you have a moment?" Her throat tightened. "Of course, Mr. Reed." He gestured subtly toward the glass corridor, and she followed, acutely aware of every curious glance trailing behind them. They stopped at a quiet alcove near the windows, where the city stretched out in shades of gray. For a moment he said nothing, as though he were choosing his words with the same care he applied to financial strategies. Then, finally, he spoke. "I wanted to thank you again," he began, his voice lower than usual, meant for her ears alone, "for that night. For your kindness, it wasn't just shelter from the storm, it was more than that, and I don't forget things like that. Maya swallowed, unsure how to respond. It was nothing. Anyone would have done the same. No, he said with quiet certainty. Not anyone. The sincerity in his tone unsettled her more than arrogance ever could. She looked away, focusing on the rain-speckled glass. Why are you here, really? Jacob hesitated, then allowed a faint smile. Because Leah invited me for pancakes. And because I realized I want to accept. The words caught her off guard. She turned back to him, searching for irony, but found none. He meant it. Beneath his composed exterior there was a man reaching tentatively, awkwardly, for something beyond his carefully guarded world. And though her instincts screamed at her to keep distance, to protect the fragile balance she had built for herself and her daughter, another part of her, the part that remembered his quiet gratitude, the part that remembered Leah's joy, found itself softening. You don't belong in our world, she whispered before she could stop herself. His gaze held hers, steady, unflinching. Maybe that's exactly why I need to be there. For a moment, time seemed to pause, the city's chaos muted beyond the glass. Maya felt the weight of choice pressing upon her, the safe choice of retreat or the uncertain choice of letting him closer. She did not answer, not yet. But something inside her shifted, the walls she had built around her life bending. If only slightly. When Jacob finally walked away, the office hum resumed, colleagues returning to their work with furtive glances. Maya stood frozen, her heart still racing, knowing with startling clarity that her world had been set on a path she could no longer control. And though fear curled in her chest, so too did something else, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time: hope. The weekend. The weekend arrived with a hesitant kind of sunshine, the kind that peered through thin clouds, as though testing whether the city was ready to breathe again after a week of gray. For Maya, Saturdays were usually a blur of chores, laundry cycles in the basement that always smelled faintly of mildew, grocery shopping with strict lists, Leah's library visits where she insisted on carrying 3 books she could barely hold, and cleaning the apartment in careful stages because the old vacuum had a habit of overheating if pushed too long. It was not glamorous, but it was theirs, a rhythm she had come to accept with quiet pride. She did not have time for leisure, not really, but she did have time for order, and that mattered more. Yet this Saturday carried something unfamiliar, something that unsettled her before the day even began. The promise of Jacob Reed's return. Leah had not let her forget. All week she had spoken of pancakes as though they were a sacred ritual, practicing how she would greet him at the door, how she would show him her drawing of a castle with 3 stick figures inside. That's you, me, and him, Mommy. Maya had laughed and scolded gently, telling her not to expect too much, not to imagine more than what was real. But children had a way of believing in things adults had long stopped trusting. And though Maya tried to suppress it, part of her found herself anticipating the knock on the door too, though she refused to admit why. By mid-morning, the apartment was filled with the aroma of frying batter, Leah perched on a chair too tall for her, stirring as best she could while flour dusted her cheeks like pale war paint. Maya tried to focus on the task, on keeping the edges of the pancakes golden, but her eyes kept flicking to the clock, her chest tightening with every minute. That passed. And then, just as she was telling herself he wouldn't come, that men like Jacob Reed had no place in apartments like hers, the knock came. It was not a timid sound, nor an entitled one. It was firm, measured, as though he had considered exactly how it should land. Leah squealed before Maya could even wipe her hands, rushing to the door with bare feet thumping against the rug. When she pulled it open, Jacob stood there, not in a suit this time, but in a simple sweater and dark jeans, his hair less rigid, his presence somehow less daunting. He held a small bag in one hand, from which the faint scent of strawberries and fresh bread escaped. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying warmth that surprised her. "I thought I'd contribute to the feast." Leah clapped her hands, tugging him inside with the uninhibited joy only a child could carry. Maya, however, lingered in the doorway, watching him as though uncertain whether this was reality or some fragile dream. Yet when he smiled at her, an actual smile, Not the polite curve of lips she'd seen in elevators, but something softer. Unguarded, she felt the knot in her chest loosen, if only slightly. Breakfast was chaos in the best way. Leah insisted Jacob flip one pancake, laughing uncontrollably when it landed lopsided. He obliged her, feigning clumsiness that Maya suspected was deliberate, and the sound of Leah's giggles filled the small apartment with an energy it had not held in years. Maya watched, torn between amusement and unease. She had guarded her daughter fiercely since the day she was born, shielding her from disappointment, from the revolving door of people who promised more than they could give. And yet here was Jacob, a man whose world was carved from skyscrapers and boardrooms, kneeling on her kitchen floor to help Leah rescue a fallen strawberry. It was disarming, almost dangerous, because it looked so natural. Later, when the plates were empty and Leah sprawled on the rug with crayons, Jacob leaned against the table, his gaze wandering over the small details of the apartment, the faded curtains, the chipped picture frame holding a photograph of Maya holding a toddler Leah at the park, both of them laughing in the sunlight. "You've made a home here," he said quietly, not as an observation but as something that seemed to matter to him. Maya shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "It's small, it's what I can afford." "It's more than that," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "It feels alive, warm. That's not something money can buy." She looked away, her chest tightening at the unexpected weight of his words. Compliments from men had never carried value for her. They often came with conditions, with expectations she could not afford to entertain. But his tone was different, not rehearsed, not transactional. It unsettled her precisely because it sounded true. The afternoon slipped by with surprising ease. Leah persuaded Jacob to read one of her library books aloud, his deep voice stumbling endearingly over the whimsical names of cartoon animals. Maya busied herself with small tasks, folding laundry, tidying shelves, but her ears never strayed, far from the sound of Leah's laughter mingling with Jacob's rare chuckles. Each sound chipped away at the walls she had built, brick by cautious brick, until she found herself leaning against the doorframe, watching them with an expression she had not worn in years, one of quiet longing. When evening came and Jacob finally stood to leave, Leah clung to his arm, demanding promises of future visits. He crouched to her level, his voice gentle as he said, "If your mom allows, I'll come by again." Then he glanced up at Maya, his eyes holding hers with an unspoken question, an unspoken offering. She felt the weight of it settle deep within her, heavier than she was ready to acknowledge. After the door closed behind him, silence filled the apartment once more. Leah yawned and declared it the best Saturday ever before collapsing into sleep on the couch. Maya covered her with a blanket, then sat at the table staring at the empty plates, a faint scent of strawberries still lingering. She should have felt cautious, perhaps even afraid, of letting someone like him step closer to her life. But what she felt instead was something far more dangerous, something she had nearly forgotten how to carry. She felt hope, fragile and luminous, daring her to believe that perhaps storms could bring gifts as well as ruin. And though she whispered to herself that she would be careful, that she would not let this go too far, she knew already that she was lying. Because part of her, the part that had lived too long in survival mode, was beginning to crave the possibility of something more. And that was a truth she could no longer silence. The breaking point, the weeks that followed, were unlike anything Maya had experienced before. Jacob Reed became a quiet, steady presence in their lives. Not constant, but consistent, which for Maya was rarer and more meaningful than any grand gesture. He stopped by on weekends, sometimes bringing fresh bread from the bakery near his office, sometimes arriving with a stack of storybooks that Leah devoured with delight. He never came empty-handed, but more than that, he never came distracted. When he was there, he was present in a way Maya had not expected of a man whose life revolved around board meetings, endless calls and responsibilities that reached across cities and continents. He played with Leah as though the world outside did not demand his attention, and he spoke to Maya with a sincerity that stripped away the cold, polished exterior she had once believed defined him. And though she tried, truly tried, to keep her guard intact, It was eroding with each passing day, like stone giving way beneath the patient persistence of water. Yet even as new warmth bloomed in her apartment, a shadow followed her steps. It began subtly, with whispers at the office, curious glances when she returned from lunch, muttered remarks she couldn't quite catch when she stepped into the copy room. At first she ignored them. Office gossip was as common as stale coffee. But the whispers grew sharper, less veiled, until one morning she overheard a colleague at the water cooler say, "She thinks she's special now because the boss noticed her." The words hit harder than she wanted to admit, not because they were cruel, but because they carried a hint of the truth she feared, that people would misunderstand, that they would twist what was fragile and real into something tawdry and transactional. She told herself it didn't matter what they thought, that her life outside those glass walls was hers alone. But the words clung to her like burrs, and by the time she rode the elevator home that evening, her chest felt tight with dread. She opened the apartment door to find Leah on the rug, coloring furiously, and Jacob stretched across the floor beside her, feigning fascination with every scribble. The sight should have eased her heart, should have reminded her of what was true. Instead, it only deepened her fear, because it felt too good, too bright, and she knew brightness had a way of drawing shadows closer. That night, after Leah had gone to bed, Maya found herself standing at the kitchen sink, scrubbing dishes that were already clean. She felt him approach before she heard his voice. "You're quiet tonight," she forced a small smile. "Just tired." His gaze lingered on her, steady, unyielding. "That's not all." For a moment she wanted to tell him everything, that people were talking, that she was afraid of what this might become, that she could not risk Leah's stability on something uncertain. But the words tangled in her throat, pride and fear locking them away. "It's nothing," she said finally, softer than she intended. Jacob stepped closer, his presence filling the small kitchen. "Maya," he said, his voice low but firm, "I know what it feels like to be judged. People have been speculating about me my whole life. But I also know their voices don't define what's real. Don't let them decide what this is." Her hands stilled in the water, the weight of his words pressing hard against her chest. She wanted to believe him, but belief had cost her before. And when she looked up at him, she saw not only the man who had eaten pancakes on her floor, but the man who belonged to a world she could never step into without losing part of herself. The fear overwhelmed her. "You don't understand," she whispered, stepping back from the sink. Leah can't become part of your world." "It's not just gossip, Jacob. It's power, it's expectations, it's—" Her voice cracked. "It's the kind of storm I can't protect her from." For the first time since she had known him, his expression faltered. He looked at her as though she had pulled the ground from under his feet. Silence filled the space between them, heavy and suffocating. Then he straightened, his jaw tight. "If that's what you believe," he said quietly, "then maybe I should stay away." The words cut deeper than she expected, sharper than any cruelty could have. She wanted to reach for him, to take them back, but pride anchored her arms at her sides. She only nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He lingered for a moment longer, as though searching her face for a sign, a crack in her resolve. When he found none, he turned and left, the soft click of the door echoing louder than thunder. Maya stood in the silence, her heart pounding, her hands trembling over the soapy water. She had told herself she was protecting Leah, protecting the fragile world she had built brick by weary brick. But as the hours stretched into the night, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in years, regret, raw and suffocating. In her room, Leah stirred in her sleep, clutching her bunny close. Maya sat at the edge of her bed, brushing her daughter's curls back from her forehead, whispering promises she was not sure she could keep. Outside, the city lights blinked like distant stars, indifferent to her turmoil. And in another part of the city, Jacob Reed sat alone in a penthouse that felt colder than ever, staring at the skyline as though it might offer answers. Neither of them slept well that night. And both of them knew, though they would not yet admit it, that the storm between them was only beginning. When the storm cleared, the days after Jacob's departure passed in a haze, each one heavier than the last. Maya carried on with the rhythm of her life work, school runs, chores, because she had no choice, because a single mother did not have the luxury of collapse. But beneath her composure, an ache lingered, relentless and unspoken. The apartment felt different now, too quiet in the evenings, too still when Leah went to bed. The small space that had once been enough now seemed to echo with absence, as though the memory of Jacob's laughter with Leah, or the warmth of his presence at the kitchen table, had seeped into the walls and left shadows behind Dot at the office. She avoided the upper floors more than ever, fearful of seeing him in his element, fearful of what her face might betray. Yet even without seeing him, his presence pressed against her from the corners of her awareness. Whispers about him filled the air: business deals, new ventures, the endless stream of responsibilities that defined him. She told herself that was who he truly was, that the man who had sat cross-legged on her living room floor reading books was only a brief fracture in his reality. But at night, when she lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, she remembered his words, his insistence that not everyone would have done what she had, his promise that gossip did not define what was real. And it was those memories, not the whispers, that stayed with her. Leah, of course, noticed. Children always did. One evening, after Maya had tucked her into bed, Leah looked up with wide, sleepy eyes and asked softly, "Why doesn't Mr. Jacob come any more?" The question pierced deeper than any rumor, deeper than any fear. Maya kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "Sometimes grown-ups get lost, baby. Sometimes they forget the way back." But even as she said it, her voice faltered. Because she knew the truth, she was the one who had pushed him away. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening, when Maya returned from work to find an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a notice: rent increase, effective immediately. Her landlord's petty revenge for Jacob's intervention weeks earlier, no doubt. Panic surged in her chest as she calculated numbers in her head, knowing already they did not add up. She sat at the table long after Leah had gone to bed, staring at the paper, her mind spinning with dread. For years she had kept them afloat, barely, always one step from sinking. But now the water was rising faster than she could bail. For the first time in a long time, she felt herself truly drowning. It was in that moment of despair that she realized what she had lost. Jacob had not just been a fleeting comfort. He had been a hand reaching into her storm, steady and unflinching. She had pushed it away out of fear, but fear could not pay rent, could not build a future, could not soothe a child who deserved more than survival. And suddenly, pride seemed a foolish shield, brittle against the weight of reality. She had always believed letting someone in meant losing control, but perhaps it meant something else: sharing the burden, trusting that storms did not have to be weathered alone. The next morning, she made a choice that frightened her more than any landlord's notice. She rode the elevator not to her floor but to the top. Her palms sweated as the doors opened to the gleaming marble lobby outside Jacob's office, a world so polished and cold it made her chest ache. The receptionist glanced up, startled, but before she could protest, the heavy door opened and there he was, Jacob in his immaculate suit, his expression composed but his eyes betraying surprise at the sight of her. For a moment neither spoke. Then Maya drew a breath, forcing her voice to steady. "I shouldn't be here," she began, "but I needed to say this. You were right about everything. I let fear decide for me, and I pushed you away because I thought it was safer. But the truth is, it's not, it's lonelier. And I can't teach Leah to live afraid of happiness. I can't keep teaching myself that either." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Jacob's jaw tightened, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she didn't. She stood firm because this time she had to. Finally, his voice came, low and steady. "Do you mean that?" "Yes," she whispered, her throat tight. "I don't know what this is, Jacob, or what it could be. But I know what it isn't nothing. And I don't want to lose it because I was too afraid to try." For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly, almost cautiously, he stepped forward. His hand reached for hers, tentative but certain once it closed around her fingers. His eyes softened, and in them she saw the man from her kitchen floor, the man who had eaten pancakes with her daughter and defended her against cruelty, the man who had found something in her world he did not want to let go. "You're not the only one who's afraid," he admitted quietly. "But I haven't slept as peacefully in years as I did in your home. And I haven't felt more human than when I was sitting at your table. I don't want to lose that either." The tension broke then, not with a grand gesture, but with a simple truth laid bare. For the first time, Maya allowed herself to believe that storms could lead not just to ruin, but to renewal. The weeks that followed were not easy. There were still whispers at work, still tensions with the landlord, still bills that stretched her thin. But there was also Jacob, not sweeping in to rescue her, but standing beside her, learning the rhythm of her life instead of trying to replace it. He read Leah bedtime stories until his voice grew hoarse. He carried groceries up the narrow stairwell without complaint. He listened when Maya poured out years of bottled frustration late at night. And slowly she learned to lean without losing herself. One evening, months later, the three of them sat on the same rug where it had all begun, Leah building a crooked tower of blocks while Jacob steadied the base. Rain tapped gently against the window, but this time it was not a storm, only a reminder. Maya watched them, her heart full in a way she had once believed impossible. She thought of the night the storm had brought Jacob Reed to her door, uninvited, unexpected. She thought of how close she had come to turning away, to shutting the door before it had even begun. And she thought of how different the world looked now, not because it had changed, but because she had allowed herself to. When Leah squealed as the tower toppled and Jacob caught her in his arms with a rare, unguarded laugh, Maya realized something. With sudden clarity, storms would come again, they always did. But this time she would not face them alone. And for the first time in a very long time, the future did not look like something to fear. It looked like something to welcome. The storm had cleared, and what it left behind was more than survival. It was life, fragile but luminous, waiting to be lived.